Welcome, everyone. Very pleased to have so many of you here with us today for this, our 25th episode of This Is CDR. This Is CDR is an online event series presented by OpenAir to explore the wide range of carbon dioxide removal solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed, and to contextualize them for policy proposals under development for New York and other states and localities. I'm Toby Bryce, based in Brooklyn, New York, and I work on CDR policy advocacy for OpenAir. Please, if you haven't already, introduce yourself in the chat and tell us where you're zooming in from. Very pleased to have you with us. Quick background on OpenAir. We are a distributed volunteer network dedicated to the advancement of CDR solutions that are essential for solving the climate crisis. Our growing global community collaborates on shared open source missions in the areas of policy advocacy, research and development, and CDR market development. There'll be a link in the chat where you can sign up for a forum to join our group, and we would love to have you join us. Quick background on CDR. Most of you are familiar with the topic if you've been here, but CDR means activities that remove CO2 from the atmosphere and durably store it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in long-lived products. When we talk about CDR, two really important things. Number one, it needs to be disambiguated with what is typically called carbon capture, which is point source carbon capture, capturing CO2 from emissions like a natural gas plant or a concrete plant. That is a form of emissions reductions, and it is not CDR. Number two, it's really important to say that emissions reductions have to be strongly prioritized in climate policy, and that CDR is not an excuse for reducing emissions less quickly or anything else. We must reduce our emissions and decarbonize our economy as quickly and as completely as possible, full stop. That said, every credible climate forecast, including in very stark terms, the most recent IPCC assessment report indicate that gigaton scale carbon removal will be required by mid-century to meet our climate goals. That's billions of tons per year. We are currently at kiloton scale, less than 100,000 tons per year. So that's multiple orders of magnitude that we need to cross in the coming decades. So it's really important that we start scaling and deployment of CDR, durable CDR, ASAP. Few resources to brief you. As I said, there are 25 episodes of This Is CDR, and there'll be a link to those in the chat. That's a great place to start. Also, there's a logo in the bottom right of the screen for the carbon dioxide removal primer, which is kind of the textbook of CDR. Additionally, the Department of Energy posted some really great materials in conjunction with their Earthshot, which is attempting to get CDR down to $100 per ton by 2030. All those will be in the chat, and so lots of great reading online to learn about CDR. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague and guest host today from Ocean Visions, Nikhil, to introduce himself and then talk a little bit about a few logistical details and introduce today's speakers.
Thank you, Toby. Hi, everyone. I'm Nikhil Neelakantan, an OpenAir member from Richmond, Virginia. So I'm involved in advocacy efforts here in the Commonwealth with OpenAir. And as Toby mentioned, I'm also a program manager at Ocean Visions, which is a not-for-profit organization with a mission to develop innovative and durable solutions to complex challenges facing our ocean. And we do this through a network of partners, and Ocean Networks Canada is a member of this network. So this talk is particularly interesting to me. Some housekeeping notes before we begin. Our format will be a 15 to 20-minute presentation followed by a few prepared questions and then moderated audience Q&A. So please type in any questions you have into the Zoom Q&A box, not the chat. This event is being recorded, and we'll send the video link to everyone who registered, and also post to OpenAir's website and YouTube channel and other social media. So now for the main event. This week on This Is CDR, we are very excited to welcome Professors Kate Moran and David Goldberg, who will tell us about solid carbon, an ambitious and important integrated direct air capture and carbon storage project being planned for deployment off the Pacific coast of British Columbia. Bios for our presenters. Professor Kate Moran is the president and CEO of Ocean Networks Canada. Her previous appointment was professor at the University of Rhode Island with a joint appointment in the Graduate School of Oceanography and the Department of Ocean Engineering. She also served at the Graduate School of Oceanography's Associate Dean of Research and Administration. From 2009 to 2011, Professor Moran was seconded to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where she served as an assistant director and focused on Arctic, polar ocean, the Deepwater Horizon, oil spill, and climate policy issues. Professor Moran is active in public outreach on topics related to the Arctic, ocean drilling, and climate change. She has also testified on climate change to the US Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works. David Goldberg is a Lamont Research Professor at Columbia University, and his interests focus on the integration of different technologies and cross-disciplinary approaches to develop achievable climate solutions. Professor Goldberg conducted postdoctoral studies at the Institut Français du Pétrole in Paris and was a laureate of the Make Our Planet Great Again program, an initiative of French President Emmanuel Macron to promote international cooperation in climate research. He has over 20 years of experience in geological carbon sequestration, scientific drilling, site assessments, and marine seismology, and led the US DOE Cascadia Carbon Safe project in 2017 to study CO2 storage in offshore basalt. He also currently serves as Deputy Director of the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. Professor Goldberg earned a BS and MS from MIT and a PhD and MBA from Columbia University. Professor Moran, take it away.
Thanks for the really kind introduction. Okay, can you see my screen? So thank you for inviting me from the West Coast. I'm zooming from the Lekwungen people's lands here in Victoria, British Columbia. And I'm going to first just kick it off by just telling you a little bit about Oceanography Canada very briefly, because it explains why we're involved in this project. We operate ocean observing systems in real time that deliver data in the water column, understanding life, the interaction with the continents. And for this project, we have monitoring systems that look at the seafloor and below, because we have sensor systems that sit on the seafloor in this dynamic geologic setting that includes a spreading center and a subduction zone. So that's what we do at Oceanography Canada. We operate this large infrastructure and deliver data in real time. So if anyone's interested in seeing other aspects of the ocean, all of our data are openly available to anyone in the world, freely and openly. And I'll come back to the image of this map in a moment. This is an image of the southwest coast of Canada off Vancouver Island. And the evolution of solid carbon really began with Dave's leadership in terms of looking at the potential of storing carbon dioxide in ocean basalt. And there's some other projects that are listed on this timeline. I won't discuss them all, but of great importance was Carbon Safe, which Dave also led, which was a pre-feasibility study that was funded by the US Department of Energy to look at the potential of the efficacy and the potential capacity of storing CO2 in basalt, and specifically looking at Cascadia Basin, which is one of the areas that Ocean Networks Canada monitors. So what I'll be talking about here is really the next phase. It's a feasibility study that we've now called Solid Carbon from Carbon Safe, and it's a 4-year feasibility study that I'll explain where we are on that. And I'm the lead PI, but Dave is a critical partner in that, as are other universities that I'll explain. I'm sure all of you know this. This is a stylized diagram of the UN Environment Program, which shows that we are going to have to be, as was mentioned in the intro, removing CO2 from the atmosphere. In geek speak, we talk about CDR as nets, or negative emission technologies, but they're the same thing, carbon dioxide removal. So if I'm using nets, forgive me, but it is the same as CDR. And of course, when we started looking at the terrestrial potential, these are numbers from 2019 US National Academy publication. These are really not enough. But what we're proposing is that solid carbon should be one of the technologies on the table because of its big capacity to actually deliver on those large scale removals. So the concept is relatively simple. What we are proposing to do in the long term is to combine direct air capture with technologies like companies like Carbon Engineering, which is here in British Columbia, with some kind of ocean system, a platform, a pipeline, a combination of systems, and then take that CO2, pump it through the water column, and inject it into ocean basalt. And the reason that this is now being proven to be one of the most durable is that the durability was proven in Iceland. Now that's what's called the Orca project, where they injected dissolved CO2 in water, injected it in the surface of Iceland, and it became mineralized within 2 to 3 years. But what we see is that the potential for using basalt really sits in the ocean space because of the large capacity of basalt in the ocean. And we've looked at the technologies, and really all of these technologies are existing. Direct air capture is existing, although it's nascent. It needs to reduce costs and increase volume. Renewable energy is especially offshore wind is now commercialized. Oil and gas technology is part of what we need to do this. CO2 injection systems. Of course, the mineralization is important. And Ocean Networks Canada brings real-time monitoring in the early stages to ensure that this is in fact a durable solution for direct air capture of CO2 and injecting it into basalt. The area that we're talking about as the first potential reservoir for CO2 sequestration in basalt is the Cascadia Basin. And the dotted line on the right shows you the outline of the Cascadia Basin, which really also coincides with one of the tectonic plates, the Juan de Fuca plate. But the capacity that has been estimated based on our knowledge of the basalt and the extent of the basalt in this region is equivalent to about 15 to 20 years of global CO2. We have current estimated costs that are on the order of $600 a ton. There's ranges that go up. In terms of what we know now in terms of technology, we hope to get that cost down to $170 per ton. And the reason that we're targeting $170 per ton, these are Canadian dollars, and the Canadian government is committed now to increase the price of carbon by 2030 to $170 per ton. Most of the cost reduction sits in the direct air capture space, and that industry is moving ahead with those efforts. The solid carbon feasibility study is funded by the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, and we competed among 17 other big idea projects to win the first ever big idea competition that the Pacific Institute led. And they support the feasibility study. It's a 4-year program. We're at the beginning of year 3, and it really lays the groundwork for a demonstration project offshore to demonstrate the efficacy of the sequestration of CO2 in ocean basalt. We also will be developing production level scalable systems that we would propose for an industrial level global scale of this technology. We have a great team, and it continues to grow. And of course, Columbia University and Lamont Doherty, where Dave is a key part of this team. And we just had our workshop that summarized the first 2 years of our research, and it is a really growing and diverse research team. Most of the funding has to go into graduate students and postdocs. So we are, in addition to developing these technologies, actually training some of the next generation of sustainable solvers for the climate problem. Where the feasibility has 3 activities. The first activity on the circle on the bottom is the technical systems needed to actually do a production scale solid carbon solution. Activity 2 is the one that I lead with Dave, and that is developing the plans to do the demonstration at Cascadia Basin. And activity 3 is really one of the most important elements is ensuring that we have research on the social, regulatory, and investor acceptance as we go along, and not to wait to do that when, for example, public acceptance could end a project like this. So I'll talk first about solid carbon concept activity 1. It's led by Professor Curran Crawford here at the University of Victoria, a superb engineer. Oops. And this is just a cartoon showing the types of technologies he and his students and postdocs are looking at. What kind of combination of technologies could be put together for a production scale sequestration with direct air capture at Cascadia Basin, which is in approximately 3 kilometers of water. So it's a wide range of combinations of these technologies, and his team is now completing a techno-economic model to look at using some of these existing technologies what would be the most economical and the most feasible in this setting at Cascadia Basin. I want to emphasize that one of the aspects that we're being very careful about in British Columbia, we have a 95 to 99% clean energy through hydro. And so we are making an effort to not be tapping into the BC Hydro clean energy, and ensuring that we are independent of that so that we don't interfere with decarbonization of society. That's one of the big important caveats that we must adhere to. I'm going to jump to activity 3 because I want to end on the activity 2, the demonstration project. The regulatory aspects have been led by Romany Webb from Columbia University, and there's publications available. There's information from her work on the legal framework and blogs at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. Her work is excellent, and so that has been a big contribution to activity 3. I should say activity 3 is led by Terry Satterfield from the University of British Columbia. And her work is really looking at the public acceptance. And so what we are seeing from the from the public acceptance, it's pretty high. Now, this is a population of both the state of Washington and British Columbia. So from her perspective, we're seeing very positive in terms of support. Excuse me. And she's also looked at the experts. What do the experts say? And again, they're talking about NETs or CDR, that most of the experts are agreeing that we do need to have these. And this was before yesterday's IPCC report. So of course, I think we're going to see that increase as time goes on. In terms of the investor acceptance, we have been looking at charging MBA teams to look at various aspects of investment and how do we move this along, both in the demonstration side and in the production side. And so we are a third cohort of students looking at business models, collaboration models, and corporate structures that would help us move this forward. These are really keen MBA students who are learning how to be good business students in a world that needs to be more sustainable. But the big issue that we want to talk about now is our next step. Our next big step is really doing a demonstration. And Dave and I are part of this activity. And the elements of it are, we're doing numerical modeling. Most of that's done at the University of Calgary, both with injection and mineralization. There's also they're beginning to do laboratory testing of carbon dioxide and basalt. And we are one of the biggest efforts that's underway is preparing a demonstration prospectus. We're well along the way of the plans for the borehole preparations and the well completion design. We have to now move forward with selection of vessels. There's several on the table and some new ideas that have come from large oil field service companies. We through the work on numerical modeling, research Dave and cohorts at Columbia have done, we have to begin to develop the injection plans. And we're starting anew on that because we had been constraining ourselves in the past to the vessels that we knew we could be made available. And now with industry's input, there's a lot of options on the table. So we'll be revisiting the demonstration injection plans very soon. One of our challenges is really securing and transporting CO2, but now we have come on board with us, one of the federal departments here in Canada, who is developing a national strategy for CCUS. And as part of that, they're developing essentially a hub and spoke system whereby they'll be starting with point source CO2, but developing hubs in major centers like Vancouver, where they'll be developing plans on how to secure CO2 for later sequestration and how to transport CO2. So we're looking forward to working with Natural Resources Canada and the National Research Council of Canada. We also have to develop, and we are well on the way of developing monitoring plans to ensure that we can monitor the plume that gets developed during the injection, to understand the rate at which it mineralizes, and to understand that the way, are there ways that we can monitor to then inform how we inject. We're also assessing the induced seismic risks. We have a postdoc who's working for the University of Victoria, but at the University of Calgary, that's looking at that potential right now. Just looking at that in the first glance, it's that induced seismicity the risk is quite low. Then Tutolo at the University of Calgary published a paper in 2021. This is just an example of part of his results showing the mineralization rate at one of the highest injection rates that he modeled. And there's a rich diversity of injection rates that he has been modeling with his team, and that was published in 2021. So here we are on how do we launch this new carbon removal industry. So as I said, we've done the carbon safe work that was led by Dave. We're now in the middle of the feasibility study of solid carbon, and our next goal is to actually do a demonstration. We hope to, as early as 2024, of course, that's very ambitious. We need funding to actually make that happen. And we already have secured in-kind support from industry, but certainly we need real dollars to actually make that happen. The reason that we're doing this demonstration at Cascadia is that in previous years, the scientific ocean drilling community has done experiments, has drilled boreholes in this Cascadia Basin location. I'll show you a map in a moment, and actually has done a similar experiment that we're proposing for a demonstration. They have, through leadership from Andy Fisher from the University of California at Santa Cruz, there's an experiment where they injected tracer-laced water into the basalt, and then actually were able to monitor its arrival in monitoring wells. And so we know the general direction of the flow. We know some of those rates. So it's one of the best studied locations on the planet for doing this sequestration demonstration. And as I showed you in the beginning, Ocean Networks Canada, we have a telecommunication cable that provides power and high bandwidth connectivity to sensors that are all along that telecommunication cable. Those data are received in real time. And so hence the combination of one of the best characterized sites because of ocean drilling and also our real-time monitoring really makes it ideal for this demonstration project. And just to give you an idea, this is a blow up of the Cascadia Basin site. At each of those orange nodes, we have extension cables that go to various sites that have various focus areas. The image I showed you of the hydrogeology experiment is in this area. And so it's quite close to the node, and we'll be developing monitoring systems that are tailored to the solid carbon injection that include physical parameters, detecting tracers, et cetera. I'll just show you, I just downloaded this morning. Anyone wants to go to our website. This is real-time data from one of the boreholes at Cascadia Basin. Well, these data are freely available to anyone in the world, as I mentioned, and we have many other types of data that if you're interested in the ocean in all aspects, please go ahead and check out our data. So in summary, what we're proposing here is one of the best options for carbon removal on a global scale. We have 100% of the CO2 would remain trapped via mineralization. Before it mineralizes, there's cap rock and obviously the deep pressure of the ocean. This is far from society. It's far superior to deleted oil and gas reservoirs from the perspective of durability and lack of the potential for leakage back into the atmosphere or into the ocean. There's a minimal impact on benthic life forms. The permanence of this really is what makes this effective and scalable. And there is a lot of basalt in the ocean. If we were to take a next step from Cascadia Basin, which has a huge capacity in and of itself, we'd be looking at places off of Central and South America. There are no waste byproducts. And unlike the offshore oil and gas production systems, this is incredibly simple subsea technology. For those who know about offshore production, these would be 1 to 2 casing strings of 300 meters of sediment that overlie the reservoir. And of course, there's significantly reduced long-term monitoring and liability because of the mineralization of the CO2. And this is, again, unlike oil and gas reservoirs where they typically have not the potential for short-term mineralization. So there's two websites here that I'll close on. We have a solidcarbon.ca. You can have, there's more information there. It's a very simple website, but we'll be posting more as we go forward. And of course, feel free to check out our data at oceannetworks.ca. And in the image, it's one of the vessels we looked at early for doing the demonstration. That's the JOIDES resolution that is operated by Texas A&M University for the Integrated Ocean Discovery Program. So I'll stop there and thank you for your attention.
Kate, thank you so much. That was fantastic. And I have to say, it's so exciting and inspiring to see such a ambitious project like this moving forward and talking about deployment. I mean, which is obviously what we all really need on all fronts with climate. So congratulations for all your success so far, and super excited to see how it progresses. Hello, Dr. Goldberg. And I'm going to start with a few prepared questions, maybe a couple of initially, you guys did a great job of talking about where solid carbon came from. So we'll skip that usual question, but a couple techno-economic questions about the capture component to the integrated complex. Number one, on the direct air capture itself, one of our previous This Is CDR presenters, Marty Odlin, who's the CEO of Running Tide up in Portland, Maine, who comes from a long history and family of watermen, water people. He says, the ocean likes to break big things. We'll put this in the chat, but when Dr. Goldberg published his recent article in The Conversation about integrating offshore wind and direct air capture and geologic storage offshore, there's a couple points of skepticism that kind of came up on climate Twitter, and I think also to some extent in the comments. Can you talk about direct air capture technology and its robustness relative to the very harsh marine environment? I think there are a couple components, sort of the mechanical function of the machines, and then also things like, your sorbent or your solvent or whatever your actual capture material is. Do they degrade in a marine environment? I know you guys have thought about that, but talk about that and tell us what you're thinking there.
Well, Kate, I'll jump in for a second on that. That's a great question, and it's an unknown, to be completely frank about it, how these systems would behave and deploy in an ocean environment. It is a challenge, and there are different ways of direct air capture, different methods of direct air capture, different sorbents. My intuition is that solid sorbent approaches are better. In this case, that you wouldn't be dealing with liquids as well. We'd have filters of some sort, and the effect of the ocean environment, the weather, the wind, salt spray, all of those factors will certainly affect the ability of the sorbent to pick up CO2, and then, depending on which method is used, how it is regenerated. Now, all we can say is what we've known from some laboratory experiments, where early work that we did in laboratory, where the temperatures and wind were introduced into those sorbents, it does have a negative effect on the ability to pick up CO2, so less efficient. But that is that was with one method. A better answer, I think, is going to come when we watch the outcomes of this project in Iceland called Orca, which Kate showed a picture of, which is about a 4,000-ton targeted capture system using the technology that is deployed by Climeworks company out of Switzerland. Iceland is pretty harsh environment. It's cold, it's windy, it's wet. I suspect there are salt issues there as well. Obviously, not quite as much as out at sea, but we will learn a lot about the ability and the downside of capture efficiency from that experiment. So the jury's out, I guess, is the answer. But we're looking at that issue carefully.
And I should also add that what's still on the table is actually having the direct air capture on the coast and powering with coastal offshore wind, and then moving that CO2 in other ways. So those options are still on the table. So there's ways to do it. And as far as the ocean breaking big things, at Ocean Networks Canada, we're well aware of that, and we're really good at making sure that things don't break. And I should also say that the offshore oil and gas industry has been building systems in very deep water, like in the Stones production facility in the Gulf of Mexico that's in 3 kilometers of water. And it's able to operate during, it's built so that it can resist hurricanes. So the technology, the people who do ocean technology have been doing it well for quite a long time.
Those are really good points. 2 quick follow-up questions. Have you looked at electrochemical DAC pathways at all? And do you think they might potentially be or less degenerated by the marine environment? And then number 2, do you think there are any potential benefits? I mean, you mentioned wind, and maybe would that reduce your contact costs? So those 2 quick questions.
So the answer to the first question is yes. Certainly the engineering group in the solid carbon project is looking at other opportunities for capture from water, electrochemical approaches, electrodialysis. There are certainly other methods for capture, and basically any capture method that is viable could be deployed as long as the energy to produce CO2 is reasonable and renewable, right? So that's, yes, that's certainly a possibility. We have thought about the direct air capture because it is being deployed, at least starting to be deployed at scale by a number of companies.
Yeah.
And exactly for the reason you mentioned, Toby, for some methods, one of the big costs in direct air capture is the cost of moving air across contactors. So when the wind is blowing, you sort of get a free benefit of moving a lot of air by. There was a paper study that we conducted in the Southern Oceans, one of the windiest places on the planet, that took advantage of maximal, sort of the extreme direct air capture system. If you could dream it up, how much could you capture? And the efficiencies in that scenario are not necessarily super high, but the wind is so strong and the energy is so potentially large that you could capture quite a bit if you were going to make that kind of investment. So yes, all those factors play.
Yeah. And just to be clear, I was asking about electrochemical DAC pathways like Burdock's. I'm going to ask you about electrochemical ocean capture pathways in a second. So the other primary point of sort of techno-economic skepticism after your conversation article was relating to DAC CapEx. It's hard enough to make DAC pay off in a always on environment. And if you're talking about using curtailed energy, which maybe you could explain to everyone what you mean by that, just to make sure everyone's clear. And then I know you've run some of these numbers, but like what does this scenario look like that you can make a DAC, the CapEx, the capital expenditure on a direct air capture machine pay off if it's not always on?
So there's a couple of questions embedded in that question, of course.
All right, yeah.
So the always on, to deal with the always on issue first, it's definitely more efficient to keep those machines running as close to full efficiency as possible. It's also most efficient to keep storing and injecting as consistently as possible. So the conception here, although we are focused on DAC and a CDR solution of capturing and injecting offshore, doesn't have to be exclusively that. And I think the concept of using an offshore site like Cascadia or elsewhere as a hub where you can get CO2 to that location to keep the injection flow going. This would be quite analogous to what is being planned and executed in Norway with their Longship project as a CO2 storage hub. That's from commercial point sources. We are adding the direct air capture or other air capture stream of CO2 offstream into that mix. So that's part of it. That's partially answers the question. The other part is the wind itself. Wind is intermittent. We all know. In that article, I was pointing out in terms of wind that a lot of the curtailed wind, or just the curtailed wind alone, which is wind that is produced, energy that is produced from wind, but not accessible to the grid. In other words, it is wasted or dumped. That alone would be sufficient to capture some CO2 if you had the systems installed. You do have to make the investment to do so.
Yeah.
That's only part of the equation. It's really a holistic approach that we're thinking about with multiple systems.
Got it. Kate, let me put this one to you. this might even be a sort of I've been really, and I know others have as well, but the idea of, since we're building these extensive platforms for offshore wind all over the world, it seems like there's just, which you guys are investigating, this tremendous opportunity to co-locate an integrated carbon removal system with these offshore platforms. Since we're already going to be out there, we're going to have the infrastructure, we're going to have people going out there to service them. You guys are, Solid Carbon's really focused on DAC. Have you thought about, or can you talk about any thinking that might have happened in terms of integrating other pathways with these offshore platforms, specifically marine permaculture, which is being done independently in the North Sea? Maybe Chris can put a link in the chat to North Sea Farmers, which is this really cool marine permaculture project with offshore wind in the North Sea. And then Dave referenced this earlier, but there are all these really kind of innovative electrochemical ocean carbon capture pathways that are emerging, ebb carbon, which has been on the program here, and sea change as well. So there are a lot of really kind of interesting approaches that could potentially also leverage this energy resource and capture CO2. So like, if you looked at those, and how do they kind of relate? Some of them are complementary to what you're doing with direct air capture, and some of them might be competitive from an energy resource perspective. But could you talk about that a little bit, Kate? And then I'm sure Dave might have some ideas too.
Well, I just think that we're making sure that we isolate the actual energy source for direct air capture from not by using green energy, and so because of that, you're already seeing that that concept really is the same as what you're just talking about. There could very well be that kind of development as the offshore wind farms off the east coast of the United States expand, and so building that into the business model for the East Coast delivery of power could include co-locating direct air capture as this gets developed. It's not there yet, but it's on that early stage technology curve. In terms of other kinds of course, we haven't really looked specifically at other kinds of like adding mussel farms or other kind of farming, but that's certainly doable. It's something that would be relatively easy to add. At Oceanography Canada, we're looking at providing basically a mesoscale platform for some of that other ocean-based carbon removal technologies. The electrochemical running tides proposal or running tides business model, fertilization. So we actually have a platform that can move some of that early stage technology to later stage. So that's not really related to solid carbon, but just the use of our infrastructure is beneficial to solid carbon, but to other kinds of ocean-based carbon removal solutions.
Got it. That's great. Any thoughts, Dave? Or
just a quick thought to emphasize that indeed, all of these CDR approaches are going to need disposal locations that are safe and secure and durable. So there's nothing off the table from a holistic perspective. It's just what is practical and how do you move that CO2 to the location. The nice advantage of co-location offshore with the infrastructure that is being deployed, for example, on the East Coast and elsewhere around the world for offshore wind, is that you then don't have to move as much CO2 or move it as far. Whereas you can, it's sometimes anyway easier to move electrons, and you would do that first. So we would not restrict any more than would not normally be restricted the use of renewable energy to replace fossil energy in the grid. It's that, but the idea of the curtailed wind in that particular case, or curtailed solar, is that wind that wouldn't be an energy that wouldn't be available to the grid anyway. And that's caused by a variety of factors, intermittency only being one of them, of the resource. But you can think of it this way: that putting a CDR, investing in a CDR system on land, or anywhere, and using that curtailed energy is another tool that allows that energy to be directly applied to a climate benefit. You can do it other ways. You could make a large investment and produce hydrogen. You could design long-term batteries that keep that electrical energy available to feed back into the grid. That might be the best resource, but those technologies don't exist either. So this is another tool as a way of chemical, if you will, chemical battery storage of energy.
Yep.
Yeah.
Got it. One last question from Open Air, and then got a bunch of great questions in the Q&A, and please keep those coming. And I'm going to flip it to Nikhil in just a second to start posing those to you guys. But you've referenced the East Coast a couple times, so let's switch coasts. And Dave, I know you've investigated this very extensively. Can you give the, we Open Air are working on a carbon removal policy for New York, so this is kind of near and dear to our hearts. Can you kind of give a quick, I know it's maybe not so quick, but as quick as reasonably possible overview of where the sort of offshore sequestration opportunity sits from a developmental perspective, research, et cetera, off the coast of New York and New Jersey? And then at a high level, just kind of walk us through what would need to happen to get us, in parallel to what Kate talked about with solid carbon, what would need to happen and how long it would take and what kind of investments and partnerships would be needed to get it operational. Big question, I know, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So there's a lot packed in there. So the concept, just to update everyone, is more or less the same as the solid carbon approach, combining these technologies as an option for offshore, using the offshore wind. It leverages the investment that is already started in offshore wind on the East Coast. That leveraged infrastructure is a big advantage, as Kate mentioned, for servicing, for creating launching points that will service multiple technologies offshore. That's a big deal. Reducing the number of, especially for capture offshore, reducing the number of pipelines and so on that would onshore to offshore transport of CO2, if that's achievable. And so the motivations are there, and the leveraging the technologies motivation is a strong one. I think the piece that is, there's a couple differences with the solid carbon approach in that the water depths are considerably shallower, but our knowledge of at least the basalt geology is a lot less, a lot lower. So we believe there's basalt deposits and reservoirs available on the East Coast. There are certainly what are known as saline aquifers that have been studied quite extensively on the East Coast that basically overlay the map of where wind deployments, wind leases are being let now. So the co-location is a strong motivator as well, doing these things and minimizing the environmental impact in more or less the same area. So it's part of the answer. What next is, and there's a lot of discussion going on with OSW providers. There's a lot of regulatory issues, I think, that should be dealt with up front, and certainly financing.
Do you have any like order of magnitude sense of what the deployment cost is per some unit of volume? Like a way to think about what it costs to get this up and running.
So referring back to that article and more recent work that we did in the faraway Southern Oceans, we did come up with estimated costs for a very large installation that you could back out what it might cost if you wanted to do that per ton of CO2. But I think it's a much more appropriate metric to think about what the investment cost will be, not the cost per ton of CO2 captured, like the $170 or $600 per ton that Kate noted. That's relevant, of course, but it's what it takes to get the build out happening. And that is, the investments are hundreds of millions right now into these direct air capture technologies. And there's $3 to $5 million per megawatt wind sort of CapEx estimate that's been discussed as sort of a generalization of costs per megawatt for a wind farm. But the technology investment is very large, the CapEx investment, and that's, I think, where we should be focused.
Got it. That's fantastic. All right, I'm going to stop asking questions now and flip it over to Nikhil, who will start asking some of the audience questions. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, there are a number of great audience questions. I'll start with one on policy and what other policies specifically in Canada that you think are needed for you guys to succeed. For example, on the government spending side on CDR, And related on the, you had mentioned the carbon tax. So one of the questions was on how important the carbon tax is to your business model. If you will start with those two.
For solid carbon in Canada. Yeah, the carbon tax in BC is now some of the money is going to go back to climate solutions, so that will be the beginning of that. And in the past, it hasn't been the case. But most important for us is to really make the case to the federal government, the provincial government, to invest in the demonstration. Because really we need government support to move this forward. And so we're making the case to both the provincial government and the federal government that this is an early research investment that will develop into a potential leadership role for Canada in this kind of technology on a more global scale. I think one of the other pieces that's happening in British Columbia is that the subsidies to the oil and gas sector are being reduced. And so although that the governments would like to just save money in that way, we hope that those can be repurposed for more sustainable industries like solid carbon.
And there were a few questions around using other renewable energy sources. I think you touched a little bit on solar, but could you elaborate on solar versus wind? And there was also a question of using the temperature gradients in the ocean. Any thoughts on other renewable energy sources and the pros and cons?
So the activity one is looking at incorporating solar, but the reality is that offshore wind is by far the winner at this stage. So, but they're not eliminating anything in case there's a need to actually utilize other sources. Actually, the ocean temperature, we've essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, but I think Curran has really ruled that out at this stage for what we're doing. So the predominant source would be offshore wind, but of course, as Dave said, we're also looking at can we look at hydrogen and other kind of new ways of powering systems.
So I can add one thought, and this again refers to some prior work we did in modeling an ocean system where with one particular direct air capture methodology. This was the humidity swing approach, which is one of the flavors of direct air capture. But we designed a system, at least again on paper, where using the temperature gradient, the cold water of the ocean at the surface where we were studying it, it basically allows you to put a heat pump, effective heat pump, a pair of heat pumps into the system and save energy, thermal energy cost. So that kind of concept is viable, I think, to pursue. These direct air capture systems as they exist use a lot of thermal energy as well as electrical energy. Either you have to make that conversion or find direct waste thermal energy, which is what is happening in the system in Iceland. There are other renewable sources with waste heat that could be very well deployed. And I'm been hearing and interested in learning more about waste nuclear heat. That basically is a large source of energy that could be deployed with a direct air capture. So there's a lot of activity in this space, and a lot of technologies being considered.
Got it. Great. There were a few questions on the CO2, and since it takes a while to mineralize, about a year, is there any issue of it escaping into the oceans? Any other considerations on the CO2 in terms of purity? And the question, maybe you can take that. And there was one related question that I'll get next.
So I'll just start, and Dave will jump in. That the Cascadia Basin site is probably one of the safest in terms of the potential for leakage. And that's because of the fact that at this site, there's 300 to 400 meters of cap rock on top of the basalt. And in addition to that, the demonstration will be actually penetrating the sediment in the minimal ways that we can and designing the actual completion to ensure there's a seal that wouldn't be breached. So it just for the demonstration, for example, just one location. So it's really quite a safe solution because you have the cap rock keeping the CO2 in, at least covering it so it can't escape until such time as that CO2 mineralizes. Do you want to add anything, Dave?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fantastic question, and it's actually the reason that this idea first came up in thinking about putting CO2 below the ocean floor in basalt, is that there are, as Kate pointed out, multiple trapping mechanisms. So the security and durability, even if there were a year or more, or even 10 years of time needed to mineralize and keep that CO2 in the basalt, it would stay in the reservoir without risk of leakage to any significant level. So that's one of the very early motivations for doing it. The other one is an interesting question as well, the one about impurities, about the source of CO2. Obviously, if it's direct air capture, it's from the air. It's not predominantly any issue. From a power plant, a point source, yeah, the purity of the CO2 is a factor. It would be potentially regulated. The amount of impurities in the CO2 stream could be a regulatory requirement, depending on where you are. I think the advantage of putting some impurities such as hydrogen sulfide or something like that, which is often mixed in CO2, into the ocean floor, just will mineralize into hydrogen sulfides as opposed to carbonates would mineralize CO2. So these are sort of dual advantages, but it is a concern, as well as the effect on the equipment that will change with impurities. So impurities are an open question, very much on the radar of all carbon storage projects.
Maybe this question that is related: are the temperature and pressure conditions in Cascadia such that hydrates might form before significant mineralization takes place? This is a question that maybe you can just to finish on this topic.
Kate, you want me to? I'll jump in on. Yeah, so the temperature at the bottom of the ocean is cold enough and high pressure enough to form hydrates. When you're in the basalt reservoir, the temperature increases. So you're well out of the hydrate formation zone. That hydrate formation, though, is another one of the trapping mechanisms. If there were, for example, a bubble leak at the seafloor, it will very likely form a hydrate. Which is at least quasi-stable until that CO2 would dissolve. So that's a natural process. But yes, it depends on how much water is in contact with the CO2 and how wet the CO2 is.
Got it. Yeah, we're running out of time, but I did want to touch on a couple of questions. One around involving the community in this demonstration. What has been done so far to involve the community in this demonstration, particularly marginalized communities, and any plans in involving them going forward?
Yes, Terry Sutterfield at the University of British Columbia, who's leading our public acceptance, her next efforts will be really full engagement with Indigenous coastal communities. And at Ocean Networks Canada, we have already a very large program that we're empowering through technology coastal Indigenous communities to monitor their own coastal environments, to ensure that they are the ones that are empowered to monitor the coastal environment for the future. And because of those partnerships that will be incorporating the goals of solid carbon into the future discussions. And what we see is that there's so many young Indigenous peoples here in the coastal environment in British Columbia that when they're exposed to science, technology, engineering, and math, that they are interested in going along on some of these pathways.
Great. I think we'd have to end there, but maybe one last question that Benjamin had was, if you were taking on new team members, what skill sets are you looking for? And maybe more broadly, like where do you see people in this community who can contribute to your efforts if you have any requests to throw out there.
Well, we have a proposal to continue solid carbon in with the federal government of Canada, and we're hoping to grow the team on basically the carbon market, the economics. I mean, that's one area where we wish to grow. And of course, on the technology side, we are getting input from a lot of the oil and gas offshore sector, but certainly people who have skills and knowledge in that area, where they know some solutions that could fix some of our problems immediately because they already exist. That also would be a great help to us. Dave probably has other additions.
I would emphasize the connection to the industrial systems and engineering design. Techno-economic analysis, I think, is something that can really be built out for these integrated systems, whichever ones are combined, whether it's the one direct air capture system and wind and storage or the others that we've discussed. But putting them together, and obviously the financial economic trade-offs are always critical to consider to find the right balance between the location, the amount of CO2 you can capture and store, the cost of the energy you need to capture CO2, the leveraging, the infrastructure requirements. All of those pieces need to be balanced with risks and costs, both in the short term and for the long term. So that's a huge ask. I think those kinds of analyses would be really valuable. Great. And
Toby, I know we are at the end of the hour. There were many questions we couldn't get to, but back to you, Toby.
Nice job with the questions, Nikhil. Thank you very much. And Kate and Dave, thank you again for being with us today. As I mentioned, it's just super exciting to see such an ambitious project moving forward. And so thank you for all your work on it, and best of luck with your next steps. I'm going to quickly share my screen so we can look at what we have upcoming. Lots of great stuff. Next week, we have Danny Cullenward from Carbon Plan, who's probably one of the leading experts on CDR standards. And he's going to talk us through some of his thinking on the standards or lack thereof in current carbon markets and how we can address those issues. Then we have Sistera, which is a quote unquote DAC 2.0 company based in North Carolina. They've raised a large amount of money recently from Breakthrough Energy Ventures, and they're very close to deploying their initial pilot plant. So that will be super interesting to hear from them. Then we have Made of Air, a Berlin-based biochar company. They make durable construction materials out of biochar. So super relevant to our work in New York with the Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act. They also have worked a lot with NYSERDA in New York. So can't wait to hear from Alison Dring, who is their fantastic CEO. Future Forest Company based in the UK. They work with landowners of productive land to apply biochar and rock dust from enhanced rock weathering for durable carbon removal. So that's super exciting as well in the context of our carbon policy work in New York. And so far as it will help the agricultural and forestry sector take advantage of the policy. Dr. Peter Kellerman, Dr. Goldberg's colleague from Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory in Colombia, who is a great expert on mineralization, terrestrial mineralization pathways for CDR, and an advisor of Heirloom, who is a past presenter on This Is CDR, as well as 4401 over in Oman. So super excited to have him. And then we have Verdox, electrochemical DAC, recently raised a large amount of money from Breakthrough Energy Ventures and some other folks, and they are getting ready to deploy as well. So lots of great stuff coming up. Most importantly right now, I just want to thank the audience and thank all of you for being with us today, our 25th episode. And thank you again to Dr. Moran and Dr. Goldberg for such an exciting presentation. Everyone be well, and we will see you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks, Toby. Bye-bye.